The scale of abuse, terror and cruelty experienced by thousands of women, children and infants in mother and baby homes is almost unimaginable. Unexplained infant deaths, disappeared children, illegal adoptions, incarceration, forced labour, illegal medical experimentation, and emotional, physical and sexual abuse. Both the Church and State have responsibility for these abuses and their legacy. The religious orders and pharmaceutical companies must be held to account and pay their share. The extent of harm cannot be quantified. The stigma that followed people all their lives, the psychological impact of losing the parent-child bond, the weight of never knowing what happened to your child, the intergenerational trauma. No redress scheme could adequately compensate survivors, but the government's proposed scheme is shamefully minimal, exclusionary, and it's insulting. Despite the wishes of survivors and the recommendations of UN human rights bodies, Minister, you're seemingly determined to push ahead with deeply deficient and even offensive reparation. With no evidence basis and purposely going against clinical experts and survivors, people who spent less than 6 months in homes as children are excluded. People who suffered illegal adoptions, medical trials, and who were boarded out will get nothing. Over 24,000 people will not be eligible. Those who the Minister deems worthy of compensation will receive as little as €5,000. For many people, it's not about the money, but that cannot be used as a defence for such an insultingly low figure. This disgraceful scheme is being done in the name of the Irish people, and I have not met one person who is not outraged by your plans. There's still time to do the right thing, to enable all survivors to access redress, and to hold church and pharmaceutical companies to account. It's difficult to catalogue the defects in this scheme, but the overarching philosophy is to award as little as possible and to grant that to as few people as possible. This principle is obvious in the bill, but some of the particulars were reported by Jennifer Bray in the Irish Times earlier this year. Documents from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform warned that extending the scheme would, and I quote, create a significant precedent regarding claims from many others in society who may feel they're also entitled to some form of redress or recognition payment based on any length of residency or attendance in an institution or other setting. That is the reality behind this scheme, the true priorities. Minister, it's clear you either have a lack of will or capacity to overrule them. I think there's a general feeling that you were left holding the bag. But are you willing to put your name to this? You seem to have decided it is good enough to stand over, and so you must be held accountable. Another tactic used is to claim you are going beyond the deeply flawed Commission's report. It has obvious and painful inaccuracies that basically absolve the Church and State of responsibility, blaming society instead. This is blatantly untrue, and it is disgraceful that the government is willing to cling to this as the definitive record. Minister, you had initially committed to providing an independent review of the testimony given to the Commission. In August, survivors learned from the Examiner that you were abandoning that plan. In December last year, we had the High Court declaration that the Commission wrongly denied 8 survivors their statutory right to comment on many draft findings. The Commission themselves are unwilling to explain their methodology and findings at Oireachtas committees, as they know full well their conduct and report is indefensible. Their recommendations are arbitrary, ill-founded and punitive. Minister, when you say you're going beyond the Commission's recommendations, I hope you realise how hollow and disrespectful those words are. There are several major issues in the bill that ignore the wishes of survivors, human rights experts and the recommendations of the Children's Committee. Firstly, the purposeful exclusion of whole categories of survivors. This is manifested in 2 ways primarily. People who as children spent less than 6 months in institutions and then disregarding whole categories of abuse such as forced family separation and illegal medical trials. The disregard for those who were born and spent time in mother and baby homes is highly immoral. It's disgusting that people are being denied any form of recognition because of frankly ignorant and hurtful statements from the Minister and officials in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. Minister, ignoring all psychological and developmental evidence, you claimed children who were in for less than 6 months would not have been aware of their experiences, would have been too young to remember their experiences. Besides being a reprehensible statement in this context, it's also factually inaccurate. That the Minister for Children is disregarding the central role of the first 6 months of a child's life for their development is wrong on so many levels. Minister, when you announced this scheme last year, over 30 clinical experts wrote to you stating that childhood trauma has the greatest impact early on in childhood. These experts pointed out that there is no threshold of time linked to this trauma, and as a result, having an arbitrary period of 6 months exposure is simply that, arbitrary. All children who are subjected to this cruel system deserve acknowledgement and they deserve redress. That is the absolute bare minimum. Officials in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform dismissed the experiences and trauma of this group of survivors because they would likely have gone on to live comfortable and contented lives. Not only is that just made up, it's wholly ignorant of all we know about mother and baby homes, the trauma and stigma that followed people for all of their lives. The exclusion is based on a dehumanising position that shows this government has no interest in evidence or lived experience. The disregard for the wishes of survivors further demonstrates this point. Minister, you commissioned the Oak Report. You presented it as a chance for survivors to have their voice heard in shaping the redress scheme. It's especially callous to ask survivors for their input, only for you to then go away and reject it. Survivors participated in good faith, shared their experience and opinions, again, only for you to ignore them. That is unforgivable. The consultation was just a tick-box exercise for the Minister and the Department. The lives and experience of survivors are just a bureaucratic exercise to be thrown aside. I want to quote some sections from the report to ensure that they are on the dull record, for the people to understand how the Minister is simply ignoring survivors. Here are 2 excerpts from the executive summary on page 9. Many survivors stated that the recommendations were inappropriate, that eligibility criteria were arbitrary and lacked an acceptance of the reality and the conditions in the home. And, quote again, the largest proportion of written submissions stated that all mothers and babies who resided in mother and baby homes should be eligible for redress, regardless of the duration or year of their stay, and regardless of whether children were accompanied or unaccompanied by their mothers. On that same page, there's a direct quote from a survivor too. I think it's disingenuous of the government to place an arbitrary 6-month redress restriction on residents. From a neurobiological perspective, the damage done to an infant is catastrophic. It is a cop-out not to include human rights. The state has failed us. It's in there in black and white. There is no ambiguity. The survivors are clear. Clinicians are clear. The evidence is clear. The Children's Committee recommendation was very strong on this issue, based on our engagement with survivors, their advocates, and human rights experts. We required that the 6-month residency requirement must be removed. Anyone who is resident in one of the institutions should be entitled to a payment regardless of the time spent therein. Minister, when I and others put forward amendments to remove this deeply insulting exclusion, will you defend it each time? Would you claim giving people access to their personal information is all they wanted every time? Or more worryingly, will you use the money message excuse to rule us out of order? The 6-month exclusion has to go. It should never have been there in the first place. The second way the government is excluding survivors is by dismissing abuses, most prominently forced family separation and illegal adoptions, the practice of being boarded out, forced labour, and illegal medical trials. Here the government has cobbled together different and equally pathetic excuses to deny any form of restitution for the harm caused by the state, church and pharmaceutical companies. The flawed Commission's findings are used as a rationale. Individuals are being told that the experimentation they never consented to, one of the most basic tenets of medical science, is a matter for them to take up with the pharmaceutical companies, as if the church and state didn't facilitate them. This group must be included in the scheme, and the state should pursue pharmaceutical giants. Adopted people and the survivors of forced family separation, one of the worst crimes imaginable, have been neglected in this process. They were not included in the terms of the Commission, meaning there is no official recognition, and they've yet to even receive a proper state apology. Recently in the Seanad, the Minister gave an attempt at an apology with a handful of survivors invited. The whole incident revealed the government's priorities rather than meaningfully recognising the abuses and crimes involved. The Oak report, as I mentioned, stressed that all survivors should be included. The principle incorporates these groups. But in case there was any doubt, it is specifically stated that, and I quote again from the executive summary, eligibility would be further extended to include those subjected to coercive family separation outside institutions or who are illegally adopted, fostered, boarded out without adequate supervision and vetting. To do otherwise, it was stated, would undermine the legitimacy of the scheme and fail to deliver a survivor-centred response focused on the nature and effects of the harm suffered by survivors. The Children's Committee, aware of the Minister's treatment of survivors, firmly supported them in our recommendation that the scheme recognises all rights violations and harms perpetuated in the institutional and family separation system, including but not limited to those identified by the Oak report. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission have strongly called for a broadening of the scheme as recognition for the range and scale of abuses in these state-run or financed institutions. In addition, there is a mountain of recommendations from UN human rights experts that the government is ignoring, hoping that the average person is not aware of them. I can only list some of the many findings. A joint letter from 6 UN Special Rapporteurs in November 2022 said that as illegal adoption may come within the legal definition of trafficking in persons, it is critical that the redress scheme establishes a process for effective investigations and ensures access to effective remedies to all victims without exception. In July, the UN Human Rights Committee called for the state to fully recognise the violation of human rights of all victims in these institutions and provide redress. In September, UN human rights experts called for redress for victims of racial discrimination and systematic racism in Irish childcare institutions. This point is important and often overlooked. Misogyny, classism, racism and other forms of discrimination were inherent in these cruel systems. Women and children from poorer families were often treated worst. Children with mixed heritages were abused. Travellers and disabled people were also targeted. An important part of transitional justice is recognition. It's truth-telling. That is not just memorialisation. It needs to be in the legislation. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission was clear on this, as were others. The legislation should outline the range of abuses and human rights violations. These should be listed and every survivor should be compensated. The scale of people currently excluded from the scheme is shocking and the amount of abuse not recognised is shameful.